All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Franklin Technical College, and we've been talking databases. In particular, we have been going over the third edition of A Beginner's Guide SQL by Andy Oppel and Robert Sheldon. I wish I'd kept track of what page I was on. But we are on up to Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 talks about creating SQL views. Now, I have defined a view in the past as being basically a saved query, which is what it is. So this chapter has, as you can see, three different objectives. Add views to a database, create updatable views, and drop views from a database. And the author mentions here, as we learned in Chapter 3, persistent base tables store the data in your database. However, these tables are not always in a useful form if you only want to look at specific data from one table or multiple tables. Before we even go on, let's just talk about what that means. If you have operations that you quite often perform on tables, and especially if those operations are complex, either in what you have to do or the size of the query or whatever you have to write to do it, then you probably want to create a view. Now, the author defines a view as a virtual table whose definition exists as a schema object. The bottom line is, a view is a saved query. Unlike persistent base tables, there is no data stored in a view. In fact, the view table does not exist. Only the definition that it defines exists. So let's assume, and I'm going to just make something up here, okay? So this might look a little bit different. But let's just assume for a second here that I'm constantly writing some kind of a query like this. All right? So let's, again, this has absolutely no meaning. But let's suppose that I'm always writing a query where I'm going through a database and I'm doing something like this. Select first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, from, I don't know, customers. Again, I'm just making that up. All right? Well, if I take that query that I just wrote and I type in something along the lines of create view v underscore customers, let's just say v underscore cust, as, and now I put the same thing we had in here before. Again, I'm not even typing that much. But the point is, now I've saved this as a view, so now I can just type in select star from the underscore cust. Now, I'm not going to take the time to count the letters, but my guess is if we counted the letters in here, there's 30, 40, whatever, and in here, there's less than 20. So you create views typically to make your life a little bit easier than it would be otherwise. So the author says, before going specifically into view or view specifics, let's go back and review some stuff we talked about in chapters 2 and 3. All right, a view is one of the three types of tables supported by SQL, along with base tables and derived tables. Most base tables are schema objects. All right, and most base tables are persistent base tables. All right, they're the ones, as it says, that actually hold the SQL data. Derived tables are merely the results you get when you do a query. And in some ways, as mentioned here, a view is kind of a cross between a persistent table and a derived table. It's like a persistent table in that the definition is stored as a schema object. However, it's like a derived table because no data is stored in association with a view. Both derived tables and views are types of virtual tables. Virtual meaning that technically they don't really exist. The data is selected from one or more base tables when you invoke the view. Views can be useful tools for accessing different types of data. One of the main advantages of using views is you can define complex queries and store them within a view definition. And then rather than having to type them in every time you need them, you can make it much simpler. So the author is going to look here and is going to give an example. So we have this compact disk inventory table, and we've got this compact disks in stock table. All right. And I'm not sure exactly where the author is going here, other than, as mentioned, if you're going to go and create a complex query, once you've created it, once you've tested it, once you're comfortable that the results you're getting are the correct results, rather than having to key in that complex query all the time, you put create view and give it a name as, and then the rest of that query. All right. So the simplest type of view is one that references only one table and retrieves one or more columns from that table without modification. Of course, because that's a simple select on one table. All right, so the syntax is create view with the name of the view as followed by some kind of an expression. So it says for now we'll focus only on the first two lines of this and leave the with check option for later. You must provide a name for the view. In addition, you must provide names for the columns. If any column are based on some sort of operations that calculate, or if the table column names are duplicated. So the bottom line is, you're really best off naming everything. Again, the idea is you can have a query that is as complex as you want it to be. And once you save it as a view, it gets much easier. The as it says, is a placeholder. So let's take a look at their example. Create view compact disks in stock. All right, compact disks in stock, copyrights, boom, boom, boom. As select CD title copyright in stock from compact disk inventory. So the bottom line is create view. That's going to be the name of your view right there. So again, which is simpler? Well, there are people that I know that work with databases on a daily basis and quite often write queries that are multiple pages long because they're burrowing through millions, if not billions, of records looking for just certain information. And what you get from using a view is it gets much easier for you to use it. All right. Now, the queries don't have to be that simple. You can actually make queries that, as it says here, have where statements in them, for example, to filter data. Later in this book, you will become more familiar with the various types of select statements you can create, and you will be able to create views that are far more complex than the one the authors are mentioned or have mentioned thus far. In SQL, some types of views are updatable. In other words, you can use the view to modify the data in the underlying table. All right. There will be people who will tell you that you shouldn't do that. All right. The author mentions here it is the syntax rules that determine the updatability of a view. There are some logical underpinnings, as it says, you can glean from these guidelines. Data within a view cannot be summarized, grouped together, or automatically eliminated. At least one column in a source table must be updatable. You couldn't do a view, for example, on read-only data. All right, if you were planning on trying to change it. Each column in the view must be traceable to exactly one source column in the table. Each row in the view must be traceable to exactly one source row in the table. Again, what you are doing here, for all intents and purposes, is you are writing a query and just giving it a name so you can save it. All right, already mentioned that. Here's an example. Create view empcom as select employee ID year 1999, year 2000 from employee commissions. So when you get done, all you have to do is say select star from empcom, and when you do that, it runs that query. Now they say let's go back and look at this last line that talks about the with check option. Notice I'm on the top of page 117 here. The with check option clause applies to updatable views that include a where clause in the statement. The best way to illustrate this is via an example. It says let's modify the view definition that we had previously, this one. As you can see, the where clause specifies that only rows with year 1999 that have a value greater than 100 should be returned. It says, however, suppose you want to update the view by setting a year 1999 to be less than or equal to 100. Because the view is updatable, it will allow you to do so. However, if you were then to invoke the view would be updated, and your updated, the row you updated would no longer be visible. So to work around this, as it says, you can use the with check option. Now, if you tried to update a year value to amount that's less than or equal to 100, you would receive an error message, all right, telling you that the change could not be made. So the with check option, as mentioned, is a handy way to ensure users don't perform updates on things they shouldn't perform. So you're putting, for lack of better words, a simplistic check in there, and you can implicitly put in what you want to check. All right. When you if you don't want to view anymore, you drop it. Drop, remember, is one of our data definition language, DDL statements. They are create, alter, and drop. So when you execute the drop view statement, the view definition is removed. However, none of the underlying data is removed because, remember, the view doesn't store the data. The data is actually in the underlying tables. They have an exercise in here that starts on page 119. It says, in this try this exercise, you will create two views in the inventory database. The views will be based on tables we created previously. The first view will be based on a single table. The second view will be based on two tables. So here's the first one. Very similar to what we looked at before. Now here, I believe, is the second one. Notice we're using two different tables, so we do a join. And I believe that's it for the chapter. This is a fairly short chapter, so I'll come back in a few minutes to discuss managing database security. But I do want to mention on there, I'm not going to go over the create and delete roles and privileges in granting and revoking, etc. I will talk about them. Let's put it this way, I'll more talk around them than talk about them. But I do want to mention a couple things about the SQL security model. So I'll be back with that discussion shortly.